Welcome everyone to the Bent by Knowledge podcast, where we will dig into what current research and the Bible actually have to say about exercise and good nutrition. After they opened up the sin door to all of humanity, Adam and Eve survived by God's grace. And when they had kids, Eve birthed Cain and Abel, amongst a whole slew of others. Just like their dad Adam, both Cain and Abel worked physical jobs. The backside of verse 2 says, "Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil." This small verse shows that the earliest humans weren't hunter and gatherer cavemen, but rather they groomed their own fields and flocks. They were people that practiced the domestication of animals and agriculture. Shepherding and agriculture were first shown to Adam by God. God showed Adam shepherding by slaying animals to provide clothing, and he showed Adam agriculture by commanding him to till the ground. So it's reasonable that when Adam had sons, one son would do one occupation while the other son would assume the other occupation. Like Abel, in these days, if you kept flocks, it meant you shepherded sheep and sometimes goats. Male sheep are called rams, which are seen all over the Bible, especially with sacrifices. Pregnant sheep are called ewes, and baby sheep are called lambs. Female goats are called doe and nanny. Male goats are called bucks or billies, and baby goats are called kids. Being a shepherd required many duties. First was flock welfare. Shepherds were responsible for the safety of the flock, which sometimes included as many as 1,000 sheep. The shepherd led the animals all over different lands to graze, which means eating the forage, and they also kept an eye out for poisonous plants so the animals didn't eat them. Second, shepherds protected the flock from predators like wolves, coyotes, bears, wild dogs, and mountain lions. To protect the animals, shepherds had a whole slew of things in their purse, literally. They had a rod shaped like a candy cane, which was 3 feet long with a sharp slate in the rounded end at the top. They also had a sling, which was used to lob stones near the straying sheep or goats to frighten them back to the flock or to drive off prowling wild animals. Thirdly, shepherds were responsible for protecting the health of the flock. The flock was susceptible to diseases and minor injuries. Shepherds also checked on the pregnant ewes at regular intervals and assisted in the birthing process. Lastly, shepherds were responsible for cutting the fleece off the flock, also known as shearing the flock, because many of the animals were not able to shed their own fleece. From the flocks, shepherds could produce food in the form of meat from lamb, sheep, or goat. Dairy products like butter, cheese, curds, and milk were also produced. And these food sources are shown throughout the Bible. Like Cain, if you practiced agriculture or farming, you tended gardens that grew vegetation, like grains, grapes, olives, etc. And it's thought that about 90% of people in biblical times lived by working the land. Grains normally included wheat, barley, and spelt. To get these grains, farmers had to sow the seed, then reap the harvest, then thresh the harvest to produce edible grains. Sowing took place after rain softened the ground. To sow, farmers used one of 2 methods. First, they broadcasted the seed by hand, where farmers walked at a constant pace and threw seeds all over the soil. Or second, farmers used a seed drill, where they directed an animal-led plow, and another person dropped the seeds through a funnel that was directed toward the ground. The plow animals were yoked together with bars that went under and over the necks. Harvesting after the plants were grown was a lot of work, and it was common to hire others to help. There were many steps in harvesting. First, they had to cut the standing grain with scythes, which were sharp tools that looked like the Grim Reaper's weapon. This was done by holding a bunch of stalks in one hand and cutting with the other. Second, they had to tie the stalks into sheaves, which were tight bundles of grain. And third, they had to transport the harvested crops to the threshing area. Threshing was a separation of grain, which was the edible portion, from the stalks. This process was done on hard, flat rocks located outside of the city or town because the process required a wind to assist in the winnowing. In this process, the farmer was able to use most of the harvested crop. For instance, the grain food was used to feed the humans. The coarse, thick straw was used for fire building and brick making. The fine, thin straw was used in animal food, otherwise known as fodder. and the fine residue of the dust or powder was used for packing around storage jars. In addition to grain, grapes and olives were very commonly grown. To make wine and olive oil, farmers had to physically press the produce using foot stomping with bare feet or mechanical presses. Some grapes were also dried to make raisins. And furthermore, figs were also a very important source of sugar. After discovering the first ever full-time jobs in the Bible, we get an idea of the normal sacrificial practices of the earliest humans in verses 3 to 4. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the first of his flock. In these verses, we see that there was a huge dichotomy between brothers and the sacrifices that were made. Cain brought some fruit, but not his best. He probably just went to a tree or vine, picked some stuff without even thinking about it, and brought it to God. On the other hand, Abel brought the best of his best. Not only did he bring the fattiest portions, which were the most pleasing to God when they were burned for the offering, but he also brought the firstborn of his flock. On several occasions throughout Scripture, God dedicated the firstborn of both humans and animals to himself. There was something really sacred about being the firstborn. Overall, Cain was careless about what he brought to the God of the world, and Adam took the time and brought his best. After this, we see what God truly thought about their offerings in verses 4 to 5. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Abel brought an offering of blood from his firstborn of his flock. Cain brought an offering of vegetation. And even though you might assume that there is a huge difference in animal and grain offerings, you should know that grain offerings were perfectly acceptable and widely used to present to God. And they may likely have been one of the most widely used because the poor oftentimes did not have access to or could not afford the animals that were acceptable for an offering. If both offerings were perfectly acceptable to God, why did God only accept Abel's offering? It appears Abel made an offering in faith and in a desire to worship God, whereas Cain was lackadaisical in his approach. Think about it this way. Would it take more faith to give away your favorite device like your phone, your tablet, or a TV, or an old device that's stored away in the basement? Much like this, Abel offered his best, and in doing so, did it by faith, because he really didn't know what would happen when he gave his best, but he did know that it would honor God fully. Cain's response to God's response was rooted in pride. He was immediately angry because he couldn't stand that his offering wasn't accepted by God, but his brother's was. Then we see how God responds to Cain's feelings in verses 6 to 7. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Just like in other parts of the Bible, God knew the answer to the questions that he was asking. But he wanted Cain to realize that what he was doing was not acceptable, and he wanted to pull Cain away from anger and violence. God warned Cain about the destructive nature of sin, so God gave the option to resist sin and be blessed, or give in to sin and be consumed. But Cain chose the path of sin and murdered his brother in verses 8 to 9. But because there isn't any nutrition in these parts, we're going to pass over the theology, but I would definitely encourage you to do your own research. In response to the murder and Cain's complete unwillingness to come clean, God curses Cain in verses 10 to 12. The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." It looks like the curse for Cain was an amplification of Adam's original curse. Remember, God made harvesting food really difficult for Adam by allowing the ground to produce harmful things like thorns and thistles that would make farming strenuous. But now for Cain, it would be almost impossible because the ground would no longer produce crops. Further, Adam was banished from Eden for protection, and now Cain wouldn't even be able to find a place to rest. He was completely a wanderer. What a loaded section. Some nutritional take-homes from this section are a bit repetitive from previous sections, but we're still going to go over them. First, what are you doing to grow your own food or raise your own food like the farmers and the shepherds of ancient biblical days? Can you do something to start small now? Maybe a small herb garden will do the trick. Second, if you can't do something on your own, how are you supporting local farmers? Can you find someone local for produce, meat, eggs, milk, cheese, etc.? And lastly, it seems that grains, grapes, and olives were popular in this area. We know that, especially if eaten organically, they can provide many benefits like fiber from grains, resveratrol from grapes, and healthy fats from olive oil. Where in your diet are you getting the organic version of these sources of nutrition?